Comrade Chair and comrades, the marvellous demonstration last weekend on the NHS is a fitting curtain raiser to this Congress, because the initiative came from comrades like Mike Foster, and at the demonstration itself, a really tremendous contribution was made by Jackie Berry, who spoke, I think, just before Corbyn himself. But it was important from another point of view. And unless we shout this from the rooftops, nobody else will draw this conclusion, that it demonstrated that we are a factor in the situation. We are not yet a decisive factor as we were during the Liverpool battle or against the poll tax. But we were a lever that moved the enormous discontent that existed in this issue and gave a lead to the whole of the Labour movement itself. It shows the decisive importance of the subjective factor. And it's not just in Britain. We saw a similar situation in Spain with a relatively small but very dynamic organisation, which will be reflected in this discussion, who intervened through the School Students' Union and have had a big effect on the general movement of the working class. And last but not least, we've seen the splendid intervention of our comrades in the USA in the intervention in the protests that followed the inauguration of Trump himself. And to add to all that, we face a new world situation which, after the victory of Trump, which represented, if not a big whip, certainly a whiff of counter-revolution, and has stirred up unprecedented and mass opposition, and a huge speeding up of events. As a matter of fact, the world now is developing at American speed. We've had more events in 4 weeks of the Trump administration, of another presidency over 4 years. To some of us, it appeared almost like the events of 40 years compressed into these last couple of months itself. And we predicted, didn't we, in our article at the turn of the year, that Trump represents a recruiting sergeant for the class struggle and for socialism, and will add to the colossal discontent that already existed before he came to power. Nevertheless, that's the conclusion that we've drawn. But there's a real frisson of fear in the ranks of working people at what seems to be a new period of reaction, and we have adopted a balanced approach on that. We've recognized the dangers, we have to fight against it, but at the same time we have to give a Marxist balance sheet of what this represents that I will touch on in relation to the danger from the far right later on. But already we've seen the way our organisation and the whole situation in the US has been stirred up. Tony Samoa has reported on the tremendous development inside the Democratic Party, on the left, if you like, of the DSA, which represents now a movement towards, if you like, in a confused way, towards socialism. There's been a big spike in radical journals like the Jacobin, and of course the marvellous mass movements that developed. Now, of course, there's ideological confusion in the US and in Britain for that matter, because at this moment in time, there is no mass pole of attraction or a force that explains events from rounded out from a Marxist point of view. But already the demonstrations, 5 million worldwide after Trump was elected, which is not as big as the Iraq War, when 30 million demonstrated against the Iraq War, but nevertheless are unprecedented for a new president coming to power. And Trump will provoke and has provoked upheavals already, not just in general from the women's movement and the attack that he represents on the position of women in society. But also in the last couple of days, the announcement of ending Obamacare with Trump Care that potentially takes away limited benefits that exists from 20 million people in the US. And like Reagan, who attacked the trade unions, when he came to power, he's promised to introduce right-to-work legislation. And yet this presidency and this government has no legitimacy in the eyes of the American people. It has a constitution more fitted to a farm-based century in the 18th century than the modern, developed, even capitalist society itself. Trump has made charges in the last couple of days of electoral fraud of 5 million people who were allowed to vote who weren't allowed to vote. Like Blair, he lies as he breathes, if you like, which was one of the statements made about Blair when he was in power. And unique of all presidents, his ratings dropped between the election and even before he was initiated into power itself. At the same time, we have to be aware that there's a big political polarization in the US, where Trump is playing for the discontented, the poor, and even the working class. And he used that terminology, didn't he, during the election itself. He's made more somersaults than my own granddaughter who's at circus school. And I witnessed some death-defying somersaults when I saw her in an event recently. On immigration, he's already stirred up a huge opposition. And the truth of the matter is, of course, playing on the theme of terrorism, but the truth of the matter is, as material in the American and the British press has shown, you're more in danger of being shot by an infant who picks up a gun accidentally, kept in homes. Or, unbelievably, you're more likely to be killed by a filing cabinet falling on you than by a terrorist in the US. But this has been used to try and shift the center of gravity towards the right. And it's not just ordinary workers or immigrants who are in opposition to this. Even the American bourgeois, or substantial sections of them, the more advanced layers, are protesting, even participating in some of the demonstrations on the very simple theme, where will we get our technical workers for IT from if this across-the-board attack on immigrants is actually introduced? And by the way, just in passing, the position of high-tech workers in the US today is symptomatic of the general decrease in living standards, where in the Bay Area of San Francisco, reports appeared in the British press recently that a collective which came to $1 million, very high-paid IT workers, could not afford their own house. That is, by the way, repeated throughout the capitalist world. There's not a city in the world that now does not have a housing problem itself. There's a deep split within the ranks of the ruling class in the US. And that, as we know in this year of the Russian Revolution, is always a harbinger of movements from below. And actually, Trump feels the ground shifting amongst the below, where there's been discussion, where there's been open speculation about the possibility, for instance, of a new Watergate. And if there was any doubt on that score, look at what's happened in South Korea in the last couple of days, where the president has been impeached. But it's an indication of the trends and the developments that are developing in society. And Trump will only feed that by the measures that he takes. As we've said, he's like a 10-year-old child with a box of matches, setting them off in a world which is already a lake of petrol. Look at the intervention, or look at the criticisms he's made of the Democrats in relation to the election about alleged Russian interference. And this Russian ambassador, who's supposed to have met, he's the most boring man in Washington, the joke has it, because nobody admits that they've ever met him, and that includes the majority of the Trump administration itself. And actually, the former CIA director said, well, of course Russia's intervened in our elections. So have we. It's par for the course, isn't it? Trump is attempting to pursue, as the comrades know, an America first agenda, a nationalist and a nativist agenda, playing to the insecurities of big swathes of the American working class. And by the way, we see this as a world phenomenon in Europe and even in Africa. And no doubt this will be discussed by some young comrades who come into the discussion over what's happening in Nigeria and South Africa, where you have the xenophobic moods because of the idea of South Africa first, because of the insecurity that working people feel at the present time. And in effect, what Trump is promising is to put the whole of the world on rations. It means more foreign disasters, adding to the catastrophe which exists in, for instance, the Middle East. And I don't have time to develop that. But that shows the future of capitalism in the neo-colonial world on the basis of landlordism and capitalism. We saw today the report of the UN that the catastrophe in the neo-colonial world will be worse in the next period and any time for something like 50 years. On this basis, there's a new relationship of world forces. I've mentioned it at some of the regional meetings that we've had. 3 major blocks of the US, which is still the main economic and military power, of China, which is a rising economic power and also a rising military power as well. And of course of Russia, whose most important feature is not so much an economic recovery, although there's been a certain recovery by Russia, but at the same time an enormous increase in military spending. And by the way, the dangers to the world are pointed up by North Korea, where a semi-serious discussion is taking place by Trump and his advisors about the possibility of a first strike, nuclear strike on North Korea. And if you think that's fanciful, it was revealed in the Financial Times that Bill Clinton actually sat down and considered a first strike nuclear hit on North Korea, and the only thing that deterred him was the fact that the facilities of North Korea were hidden underground itself. So it shows the intractable character of the crisis of capitalism from a world point of view. It's 6 years, really, since the North African Revolution. It takes a leap of the imagination to go back that 6 years and the marvelous mass movements in Egypt, of the developments in Tunisia, and so on. The toppling of 4 dictatorships. Libya, unfortunately, gave them the excuse for the counter-revolutionary forces to intervene. And let us not forget, there were some alleged Marxist, even Trotskyists, like the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, who supported imperialist military intervention, that we steadfastly opposed. They own the catastrophe in a certain sense that exists in Libya at the present time, because they abandoned the basic class criteria, never depend upon the class enemy to solve any of the problems of the world, rely on the organizations and the power of the working class itself. And that remains true throughout the Middle East, even today, where they're now talking about the possibility, an analogy with the Middle East, of a 30-year war scenario. We think that's entirely pessimistic. Before then, the working classes in some of the major countries in the Middle East will rise and move against landlordism and capitalism. We've seen the Syrianization of Turkey in the last period. Very interesting, the situation that's developing there. But on a bourgeois basis, the only prospect for the Turkish people would be actually the further Syrianization of Turkey itself. Now, on top of this, we have the impossibility of the bourgeois to manage the world economy itself. Events have profoundly affected the economic perspectives for the world. There is now unmistakably a generalized crisis of capitalism, which is reflected, of course, in the economy, but which is reflected in politics and socialism, and socially. There's complete pessimism in relation to the strategists of world capitalism on the world economy itself. Even growth has been lopsided, where now, instead of inequality narrowing, as all the comrades are aware, it's enormously widened since the crisis of 2007, 2008. And you know the figure. 50% of the world's wealth is now owned by 8 individuals, 6 of them men and 2 unspecified individuals. Bernie Sanders made a comment and said, this is insanity. And that is the essence of capitalism at the present time. And I've read 2 books recently. There's like 15 or 20 books come out on the dilemma facing capitalism. But 2 books have stood out. One that's entitled, How Will Capitalism End? And the conclusion that the author draws is that the authorities must be scared shitless. And they are when they view the world economy. Policymakers are in despair at the weakness of the world economy at the time of the Brexit vote. That's a direct quote from the Financial Times. It's true, if you read the press this morning, there's been a certain growth of over 200,000 jobs in the US in the month of February itself. Yet the real secret to explaining Trump and the situation in the US today is, despite this alleged jobs growth, 60% of the US population are unhappy with their lives. And why? Because these jobs are meaningless against the background of low-paid, insecure jobs which affect, as in Britain and the world today, whole swathes of the population itself. The crisis of 2007-8, in that first year, Obama played a crucial role in saving capitalism. I have a quote here. I don't have time to use it, unfortunately, because there's too many other important points to make in this discussion. But Obama saved capitalism. That first year was worse in its economic effects, potentially, than the crisis of 1929-1933. And only because Obama stepped in and saved them, as he put it himself, from the pitchforks, in other words, from revolution, was capitalism saved at that stage. Trump built on the deficiencies and the retreats of Obama. Now we have the oligarchs gathering around Trump who are demanding payment for the victory of Trump. They are preparing to abolish even the minimum restrictions that are being put on by Obama. And that's preparing, particularly in the banks, where they're going to let the banks rip. And that is preparing a new crisis, a new 2007-8, only much worse. All the features then which led to that crisis are present today. The investment in derivatives, which was phony and built up huge debts. The colossal development of loans on cars, which is building up the pile of debt. Not just in corporations, but in households. The huge mountain of debt for students and so on. Now, against this background, Trump has said, well, he's going to introduce a new stimulus package in relation to the infrastructure. And by the way, that is a byproduct of the organic crisis of capitalism itself. It's not restricted to the US. It's in Europe. Recently, some of the bridges over the Rhine had to be closed because of the fear of their collapse. And that undoubtedly is a big issue in Germany at this stage. It's true in Britain, isn't it? With the catastrophe that exists on the roads and on the infrastructure itself. But if Trump succeeds against the odds by enormously piling up debt and increases employment, that will be a boost for the working class. And that could lead to a fight back by the working class in this period itself. It would be very good. But nevertheless, it will not solve the problems, the underlying problems of capitalism. The period of high-paid jobs has gone forever in the US and elsewhere. It's been replaced by the gig economy, which is a fancy name for the wage slavery of the 1930s. Now the problems have been enormously compounded, ironically, by the development of new technology. And we've written a bit on this issue in the pages of Socialism Today. Comrades should dig it out and see what we wrote about the incapacity of capitalism to harness the genius, really, of the population of the working class in the developments that are taking place. Hammond referred to it in the budget speech, the new possibility of events, of developments in the US economy. Stephen Hawkins, however, he sent some rubbish things in relation to Jeremy Corbyn. Well, Hannah will deal with that in the discussion on Britain. But he made a very good point, he said. As far as artificial intelligence and new technology are concerned, it is either the best or the worst thing to happen to humanity. It puts it in a nutshell, if you like. There's an enormous apprehension about the introduction of new technology. When a firm in Japan can sack the whole of the workforce, it's not exactly going to be welcomed with open arms, is it, by the working class? And NHS Direct has the same position itself. It won't just affect the working class, but so-called middle-class jobs will be profoundly affected. This means that capitalism cannot harness the fruits of new technology. If Trump is successful in getting some of the jobs returned from Germany or from China or from elsewhere in the world back to America, that was his promise during the election. If they do return back to America, those jobs won't be done by unemployed workers, they'll be done by robots. That's already the prediction of the economists. And Bill Gates, the richest man in the world, has come forward with a very profound solution to this problem. He says, tax the robots. Just as Hammond suggested taxing the self-employed in Britain. Tax the robots. And one other economist has stepped forward and said, why pick on the robots? Why not tax all new technology that's being introduced? And even if this was done, it would aggravate the central problem of world capitalism today, which is the lack of demand. It's insane to say that there's a lack of demand in a world that's crying out for the goods that can be produced on the basis of a new system. It shows from a rational point of view, capitalism is a real barrier to the development of society, and not just in terms of jobs, but also in terms of the solution as well, where you have now the flotation of, in Finland and in Sweden, of a basic income and of the unemployed. This represents the fear of the ruling class of what this means as far as capitalism itself is concerned. They can no longer provide the jobs to meet the demands of society and meet the demands of the working class. So it's a step towards what Trotsky raised about maintenance in the transitional program, of maintenance of those who cannot work. And our demand should be, if you cannot provide the jobs, we demand not just a small income, but we demand a full wage, we demand full maintenance. If you can't provide the basics for working people, then to hell with you and disappear from the scene of history, because we will be able to do this. The position of Trump, of protectionism, is not possible in the way that he's imagined in this situation itself, because it will produce a worse position than it's trying to solve. And by the way, when he announced he's going to build a wall between the US and Mexico, the other day, the Great Wall of China Society made a very important point and said, the Great Wall of China didn't keep out the Mongols. Despite the enormous expenditure of the Emperor of China at that stage, and no more will the Mexico Wall do the same. These developments in the US are mirrored by the developments in Europe as well. There's a small growth in the US economy, and the governments continue to denounce inequality and so on, like Theresa May when she first came to power. But they say that on one side of the mouth. The other side of the mouth, they're actually talking about austerity, because that's the reality of the matter, and therefore continuing to attack the problems of the working class. The fundamental problems, in other words, that existed between 2007-8 have not been solved, and potentially they were in a worse situation today. Europe, particularly in southern Europe, is not just in recession, it's in a depression. Greece is a social catastrophe. 50% of the population of Greece are living off the pensions of their elderly relatives itself. And the attack that Trump's aide has made on the EU in relation to the EU, where he, for instance, singled out Germany, and he said Germany is working unfairly in relation to America. They have the biggest trade surplus in the world, Germany has at the present time. And he said, Trump says, I'm going to take measures against you. Really, what this comes down to is Trump and American capitalism trying to put the rest of the world on rations. And that's one of the reasons why the insoluble problems of European capitalism has resulted in Brexit, but not just Brexit. We now have the danger of Frexit, of an Italian exit from the EU, and not just a crisis of capitalism that goes with that, but also a crisis of those parties who've remained within the framework of capitalism. Above all, of social democracy. Look at what's happening. Leave aside the complete discrediting of those parties who stood on the basis of social democracy in Spain, in Greece, in Portugal, and so on. Look what's happening in the strongest economy of Europe today, with the developments around this figure Schulz, who's been elected to the leadership of the SPD. And how has he managed to have a position where he's neck and neck, or maybe even overtaking Merkel at the present time? Not by putting forward a classical social democracy, but by repudiating the program of Schroeder, of the so-called the Schroeder reforms of 2010, which resulted in a massive neoliberal cheapening of wages, and it's that gave the advantage to German capitalism. But he supported that, by the way. He wasn't in the government, but he supported along with all of those so-called oppositionists at the present time. But what it indicates is the unviability of right-wing social democracy at this stage. It doesn't mean to say that a form of left-wing reformism could not develop at the present time. More immediately, as most of the communists are probably aware, is the fear of the far right, either participation or taking a majority, like for instance in France, and that in turn has generated in the pre-conference discussion about the question of the balance of class forces, which we've had in our material, where we say it's impossible because of the balance of class forces today for a classic fascist development to take place. And because many of the younger communities have not yet experienced the demonstration of the mass movements of the working class, this can appear as an abstract possibility, as an abstract issue. But it's not. It's necessary for us to counter those who very irresponsibly and loosely talk about the dangers of fascism. That's not what's posed at the present time. And when we talk about the balance of class forces, we're talking about the developments of the middle layers today. You could not have a position today, notwithstanding what I said about America, that's a distant prospect. You could not have the position today where the middle class could be used as a mass battering ram against the organizations of the working class, as was the case in the pre-war period in Italy, in Germany, in Spain, and so on. Because at this stage, the middle classes, the junior doctors, and other layers have demonstrated in Britain, are moving towards the left, are looking towards the workers' organizations, are adopting the methods of the working class, such as the strikes and so on. Nevertheless, the danger of the far right, it is whipping up opposition, and above all from the youth. And we have to be part of that movement as well. And we have to say we don't underestimate the danger of the far right and what it could represent. For instance, in France, it cannot be ruled out that Marine Le Pen could win in the elections in a couple of months' time. She's hovering. There are different, indicating the volatility, there are different polls now as to what can happen in the runoff in the presidential elections. But one poll put her about or near 50%. It all depends on what the opponent is for Marine Le Pen. And what a mess, if you like, the left in France have made of this. We at least have come behind Jeremy Corbyn, and we're still giving critical support to Corbyn. And by the way, Corbyn's star is very high outside of Britain. As his star begins to wane in Britain, he becomes very popular in other parts of the world. Bernie Sanders commented him overnight in relation to a Guardian discussion. And he's there in Spain, he's there in France, People have painted themselves in the colour of Corbyn. And that's why the material we produce is important, not just from the point of view of Britain, but internationally as well. We have this character, Markham, with his movement El Marche, which means mark. Really, it's not even calling itself right-wing social democracy. It's coming forward with counter-reforms, of attacking the 35-hour week, of abolishing the labour laws and so on. And yet he has a real chance of winning, rather on the basis of the illusions of what he represents, of something new, rather than the reality of what he actually means. And people like Mélenchon seem to have left it too late. He would potentially was in a position to emulate what Corbyn did in Britain. On the other hand, in Holland, we see this phenomena of the movement around Wilders, which, by the way, is unique in the world. He only has one member, and that's Wilders himself. And he's quite open. Well, if I have a rank and file, there'd be discussions and debates and opposition, like with UKIP. So there's one member. He's the only member. He has more MPs than that. God knows how they're counted. Maybe they're counted as sympathisers. But he's ridden. I mean, there's an election in Holland in the next couple of days, and he will come out with a significant position. It's unlikely that he'll be able to form a coalition with the governing party at the present time of Rutte, who, by the way, is himself, in answer to Wilders, adopted a Wilders-light position. In other words, he's accommodating to the racist, demagogic campaign that's being conducted. These are all a product of the crisis of European and of world capitalism. And even if there's no immediate movement or no immediate crisis and a movement responding from that, all of these factors are playing an enormous role in radicalizing and potentially radicalizing the working class. If there is another crisis along the lines of 2007-8, and the bourgeois will do everything to avoid that, that will raise all the issues that were raised immediately in the aftermath of that crisis. It will put the question of nationalization squarely on the agenda. The question of socialism, particularly if a movement will develop in the US with that inscribed on its banner. That will have an effect on Europe and of the world itself. But at this moment in time, the leaders of the left, the so-called leaders of the left, the prominent spokesmen for the left, are reluctant to even draw conclusions of a socialist character. That's why we have this phenomena of populism. Populism is really a term when it's impossible to describe accurately, from the point of view of the bourgeois, what this phenomena represents. It's radical, or so-called radical, in its demands, or some of its demands, but it's not yet socialist. And even the populist leaders, like Bernie Sanders, refuses to call for the nationalization of the banks. When he was interviewed in The Guardian, he describes himself as a progressive, not as a socialist. And that's an indication of the mood that exists. He's really the twin of people like Owen Jones and Paul Mason, who can describe very well the crisis of capitalism and the effects of capitalism. But when the alternative is imposed, they're absolutely lost. And why are they lost? Because they have no faith in the capacity of the working class to arrive at fighting combative slogans and demands and the idea of socialism. Of course, parties play a key role. And the revolutionary movements plays a key role in demands. That's why we had such an effect at the demonstration last weekend on the demands that were raised, which was in tune with the way that the working class were thinking on that demonstration and beyond that demonstration. But nevertheless, revolution is not made by revolutionaries. Revolution is made by the objective development of events, like the February Revolution, where Lenin said, well, we might not see a revolution in our lifetime. Nevertheless, the general idea of a revolution was put forward by Lenin and Trotsky. They prepared the ground with their organization and came forward at appropriate moments with the correct program and slogans which were eagerly taken up by the working class, which itself was coming to the same conclusions as Lenin and Trotsky. Yes, it took a further 9 months for the working class to clarify and see only the Bolsheviks were prepared to go through with the revolution. It will be much longer than that in our case, because the war immediately enormously speeded up the development of events. But there's no real alternative being put forward by these people. That's why our party, why our CWI is so crucial at this stage, to reach the advanced layer and give them the way forward on the basis of events, but also put forward a fighting program to develop the strategy and tactics which can arm the working class for the struggle. That's why our visit, myself, Danny Byrne and Linda Taaffe, to the conference of the School Students' Union in Spain, and you'll see it in this discussion, hopefully, was so important for us. These comrades at least understood. And what is Trotskyism, by the way? Unless it can relate to the real movement of the working class. It remains a fact that only this organization and these comrades in Spain have found a road to the working class. I'm not talking about discussion circles of left intellectuals, where they've got a very good basis. Only this organization, in Western Europe at least, it's a different case in Latin America, in Liverpool and in the poll tax, resonated with the movements of the working class. And we're beginning to do it again. The comrades in Spain are beginning to do this as well. The way they intervened not just in the School Students' Union, but the way they intervened in the Congress of Podemos, which is a model and was exactly the way that we've tried to intervene in the movement around Corbyn itself. And where that battle was very significant within Podemos, where the equivalent of Owen Jones, Heracon, I think I pronounced his name correctly. He looks like Owen Jones, by the way. He's a taller version of Owen Jones, and he has exactly the same credentials politically as Owen Jones, because he wants to form coalitions with this force or that force. Absolutely no confidence that Podemos, by working out a clear program, could go to the Spanish masses and win a majority. And we fought for that. And that's a very important point of strength for our organization on the Iberian Peninsula. It goes together with the marvelous small force that we've got in Portugal, who've already been attacked and expelled from the left bloc, even before they have made an impact. But it's a very small force. It reminds me of what happened in the 1960s, when we were expelled in Britain, and then the International Social Democracy introduced a clause where any member of militant was automatically expelled before they arrived in the country. And when comrades arrived and applied for them, they said, you're already expelled. That's an attempt to deal with the ideas of revolution and the organizations of revolution by an organizational approach. There's particular movements or big movements in Latin America. In Eastern Europe, I haven't got time to deal with that, but the warning red flashes are at the moment. Eastern Europe is threatening to go into another meltdown. And by the way, is it an accident that in Poland, in Hungary, where you have this creature, Orbán, who's a right-wing prime minister, then you have Jobbik, which is really an open fascist organization, in the last couple of days has made overtures, or the last couple of weeks, towards the Jewish people, has expelled people for spitting on a Jewish grave, and is attempting, obviously, to emulate what Marine Le Pen did in France by cutting away the open fascist aspects of their program and trying to appeal on a far-right position, and by the way, including even some radical demands in that battle. Comrades, we have a very good situation developing internationally with the crisis of capitalism, with the developments that has taken place within our ranks in Spain, in the US, and this is preparing the ground for us to really develop a powerful position. If Sharma Savant can have an effect, not just in the US, but in Latin America as she's done, or in India where there was a big headline, I think in a Delhi newspaper, about a role in the anti-Trump protests. If that's possible now, imagine if we can build a force which is worthy of the American working class, that's developing at colossal speed, that can draw far-reaching socialist and even revolutionary conclusions. We can grow to become a bigger force numerically and in our position than the American SWP was in its best days. We're not talking about the counterfeit varieties that exist today. We're talking about the American SWP under the direction of Trotsky. They made a powerful impact, at least in parts of the working class. We are poised to do that in the US, on condition that we have the clear program. We have a clear perspective. We have a clear analysis of the development of events itself. And it's not just on economic issues. It's on the issues of global warming and the ruinous pollution that affects us in London now. Visible effect on the health of the population of London itself. There is more children killed through air pollution than AIDS and malaria. 1 million at least in India at the present time. Neither Trump nor his system, capitalism, nor all the other little Trumps throughout the world is capable of solving the problems of the society and the problems particularly of the working class. What's happened in the US? What's developing in Europe is just the start. It's a period when new earthquakes, not just natural earthquakes, but social earthquakes will take place. There will be a mass awakening. This will present many opportunities for us. And it's not an accident that we're growing in Europe, in America, and in the neo-colonial world as well. And we're adding to our forces. We don't exaggerate it. We're a small force at the present time, but the Russian Revolution shows, and the Chinese Revolution for that matter, in 1919 showed a small force can have an effect out of proportion to its size. Every comrade in the British organisation must be infused with the spirit of internationalism, and not just in general, but what we can do to assist the building materially of our international throughout the world itself. We are growing when all others are beginning to face splits and divisions. We have developed this idea of building an international, but not one that's intolerant, it's rigid, that takes account of the different strains and stresses that will develop in a mass international. Our aim is not just a little group. Our aim is to develop what we've done on a national scale to develop a mass influence. What we're developing in Ireland at the present time. And you'll hear from Paul about the attack on our comrades there. But they've done that, why? Because our party in Ireland has defeated the water charges. And this is an attempted revenge. And we must do everything materially, politically and material, to come to the defense of our comrades, no matter where they are. But over and above that, we have to build an international in this year of the Russian Revolution that will be worthy of the working class. The masses are taking to the road of struggle. They're looking for a new road. They're not exactly sure what this new road represents. This is the reason for this ideological churning. And it's a huge churning that's taking place. Where one book, another book that's just come out, I won't go into it, but saying, well, capitalism has the potential to overcome the problems of the society, of unemployment, of poverty, and so on, just as they did in the past. Just as they did, for instance, after the First World War, and then particularly after the Second World War. But that was in a position where American capitalism was able to underwrite Europe. And by the way, the loan that they gave to the British capitalists was only paid off in 2006. That's the decisive role that American capitalism played. They cannot do that anymore. They're putting the rest of the world on rations, not offering to give rations to the rest of the world. And that's the decisive change in the situation. Comrades, we have to build a force that is worthy of the working class, that is worthy of the goals that we set ourselves, to build a movement in thousands, ultimately in hundreds of thousands and millions, and give them the theoretical ammunition for a whole epoch. That's what we set ourselves the task. And this will lay the basis for mass parties and a mass international. Thank you.